My name is Kara Bradley, and in this presentation I will discuss some of the basics of cell signaling, and then I will focus more specifically on cytokine proteins, which play a really important role in regulating our immune system. And then I will go on to discuss the role that these specific proteins play in COVID-19 patients who are experiencing a cytokine storm. All cells, especially cells living as multicellular organisms, must be able to communicate with one another in order to maintain homeostasis and coordinate their behaviors. Individual cells, like multicellular organisms, also need to be able to sense and respond to their environment to survive. Most animal cells are able to both send and receive signals, and they can therefore act as both signaling cells and target cells. The cell signaling process begins with reception, which occurs when a cell receives a signal, and then the cell produces intracellular signaling molecules during transduction, which will ultimately lead to a response inside the cell. Cell signals can be cues from the environment, such as touch, light, temperature, or change in concentration, or they can be cues that are generated from within the body of a large organism. For example, the hormone epinephrine can increase cardiac output and raise blood glucose levels. The majority of extracellular signaling molecules are proteins, peptides, or small hydrophilic molecules that bind to cell surface receptors that span the plasma membrane. Whether a cell will respond to a signaling molecule depends on whether it possesses a receptor for that specific signal. Target cells possess proteins that are called receptors that are able to recognize and respond to specific signaling molecules. Each receptor is usually only activated by only one type of signal. And as you can see from the picture on the right, we have a small hydrophilic signaling molecule, and it has binded to a cell surface receptor that is made specifically for that signal. And once this binding has occurred, it will start the process of transduction. The receptor protein performs the primary step in signal transduction. It recognizes the extracellular signal and generates new intracellular signals in response. The resulting intracellular signaling process usually works like a molecular relay race, in which the message is passed downstream from one intracellular molecule to another, each activating or generating the next signaling molecule in the pathway until a response is generated that alters cell behavior. And as you can see from the picture on the right, there is a signaling molecule at the top of the picture which binds to a receptor, and this causes the receptor to activate, which then causes the transduction signaling cascade, which will ultimately lead to a response within the cell. The signaling pathway continues until a metabolic enzyme is kicked into action, the cytoskeleton is tweaked into a new configuration, or a gene is switched on or off. This is called the response of the cell, and it is the final outcome of a cell signal. The response time of a cell can be either fast or slow, depending on what process is happening as the final result of the cell signal. Changes in gene expression tend to be slow, while changes in protein function, such as movement, secretion, or metabolism, tend to be faster. Now that we have a general understanding of how the cell signaling process works, we can begin to discuss cytokine proteins. Cytokines are small proteins that play an important role in cell signaling as they function as chemical messengers to regulate our immune systems. Some examples of the different types of cytokines in the human body include chemokines, interferons, interleukins, lymphokines, and tumor necrosis factors. These cytokines are produced by virtually all cells that are involved in our immune response, such as macrophages, B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and mast cells. Cytokines are produced in response to an antigen and are crucial in controlling the growth and activity of other immune cells and blood cells. Cytokines affect the growth of all blood cells and other cells that help the body's immune and inflammation responses. Cytokines are important in health and disease, specifically in host immune responses to inflammation, infection, trauma, sepsis, cancer, and reproduction. On this slide, I have included a diagram of a normal cytokine response in the human body. The process begins when a virus is inhaled and infects the lungs and other organs. Once the virus has entered the body, it is detected by monocytes and macrophages. The monocytes and macrophages then release cytokines into the bloodstream to stimulate the body's immune response. Once the cytokines have been produced, they recruit the help of the body's T cells, which further stimulate pro-inflammatory cytokine response. The cytokines promote vasodilation, which is the dilation of blood vessels, and increase the permeability of the cell membrane. This helps to enhance the delivery of the immune cells right to the infection site. The cytokine enters the infected tissue, causing localized inflammation and some of the symptoms that are regularly associated with illnesses. The anti-inflammatory cytokines then moderate the inflammatory response as your immune system fights to clear your body of the infection. Everyone has cytokines circulating in their bodies. That's a normal part of the immune response. But when that response overshoots where it should be to clear an infection, that's when it becomes pathological and is considered a cytokine storm. Normally, cytokines are produced only briefly and are then shut off when the help has arrived. But when a storm occurs, they keep sending the alarm long after it's needed. You could think about it like a smoke alarm. In a normal situation, the smoke alarm will go off and then the firefighters will arrive and shut it off. However, if the alarm is never turned off, you will continue to call the firefighters over and over again to come shut it off until there are too many firefighters at the scene. Cytokines can become dysregulated and pathological in cases of inflammation, trauma, sepsis, or hemorrhagic stroke. The oversecretion of cytokines in these cases can trigger a dangerous cytokine storm. Cytokine storms are life-threatening systemic inflammatory syndromes involving elevated levels of circulating cytokines and immune cell hyperactivation that can be triggered by various therapies, pathogens, cancers, and autoimmune conditions. On this slide, I have included a diagram of what is happening when a patient experiences a cytokine storm. The process begins when a virus is inhaled and infects the lungs and other organs, triggering a normal immune response. The macrophages and dendritic cells release cytokine proteins just as they would in a normal immune response. An inflammatory reaction begins to occur, and the cytokines and lymphocytes destroy the invading pathogens. Some of the lymphocytes become damaged while they are trying to fight off the infection, which causes them to release even more cytokines to try to help fight off the infection. This causes the immune response to cycle out of control, and the inflammatory reaction will continue to increase. The increase in the inflammatory response will cause your body to begin to destroy healthy cells, which causes acute lung damage and many of the other symptoms that are associated with a cytokine storm. With cytokine storms, many doctors are seeing mild cases of COVID-19 deteriorating rapidly into more severe cases. Dr. Pavan Bhattaraji, an assistant professor at the University of Washington who works in the intensive care unit at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, said, "We've seen some patients rapidly worsen. They initially were just requiring a little bit of oxygen, and within 24 hours they're on a ventilator. This crash that Dr. Bhattaraji is describing typically happens 7 days into the disease and can occur in young, otherwise healthy patients. About 20 to 30% of patients who are hospitalized with COVID-19 will develop severe immune manifestations, in some instances leading to cytokine storms, with life-threatening organ damage and high risk of death. Researchers believe that the cytokine storms might be being triggered because the virus is continuing to replicate despite the body's immune response." Although there's limited data on how cytokine storms affect COVID-19 patients, some doctors are already treating people who have the disease with powerful anti-inflammatory drugs to try and slow or stop the process. Anecdotally, this approach seems to be working. One class of drugs, in particular, shows some anecdotal evidence of helping. Known as interleukin-6 inhibitors, they block a specific type of cytokine which is associated with inflammation. But other researchers caution that this untested treatment can carry significant risk. Suppressing the body's immune system at the exact moment that it's trying to fight off the deadly coronavirus could have all sorts of unintended consequences. For example, interleukin-6 is important to stimulate the production of antibodies. It also stimulates the production of T cells, which help your body to fight off infection. So although inhibiting this specific cytokine could prevent a cytokine storm, it could also cause the patient to have a harder time fighting off COVID. Ultimately, more data is needed to determine how often a cytokine storm is the cause of a patient's sudden illness in COVID-19. and when or what drugs doctors should be administering when a patient does begin to experience a cytokine storm. Regeneron, one of the companies that makes interleukin inhibitors, now has clinical trials underway to test the effectiveness of interleukin 6 inhibitors and other drugs against cytokine storms. They hope to release the initial findings of the Phase 2 portion of the trial by the end of April. Even if the treatment proves to be beneficial, it would not be intended for everybody. Interleukin 6 inhibitors would not be helpful for elderly patients with other chronic underlying diseases. But for those who don't have any chronic diseases, and even for some of those who do, it could help them to fight off a cytokine storm. That's all I have, but I've listed all my sources here in case you would like to look into anything further. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your day.